Well, let me tell you something that happened in our house last night. Last night, we were cooking supper. We had 2 items on the plate. I cooked one and Cindy cooked one. She did French fries, not the frozen things. She cut the potatoes up, put them in the air fryer. She did a wonderful job with those, okay? And then, oxymoron here, I did fried chicken in oil. And I mixed up the batter, and I put it in, and we're eating, and Cindy says, the chicken's a little dry. I said, well, I used a different flour, and I think it's the flour that I used. And she said, without batting an eye, and because of that, that's why we had to chop you. I am banned from our kitchen unless I come back as one of America's worst cooks. She had no idea I was going to tell that story. Cupcake wars are different than what you see on the Food Channel. We have to clean up the mess. No. All right. Well, that had nothing to do with my message, but we needed something a little light before I share what I'm going to share with you. 2 weeks ago, a man went up to the 32nd floor of a hotel room, broke out the window, and shot down into a crowd of 20,000 people, killing 58, and injuring more than 500 people. So we're shooting ever in American history. Between 2014 and 2016, the nationwide homicide rate increased more than 20%. The estimated number of murders in the nation of 2015 was over 15,500 people, with an increased total of over 17,000 people reported killed in 2016. New projections based on data from 30 of the largest U.S. cities suggest that in 2017, that number will drop by 2.5%. It's going in the right direction, but it still means over 16,000 people will be killed in 2017 at the hands of somebody else. Well, it seems that a discussion of God's commandment against murder would certainly be appropriate for today. We've been doing a series on the 10 Commandments called Back to the Basics. Today we're going to look at the 6th commandment, the commandment against murder. We're going to answer 4 questions, or try to answer 4 questions as we go through this. So I'm starting with your notes now if you'd like to follow along. The 6th commandment, Deuteronomy 5:17 says, "You shall not murder." Maybe the way most of us learned it was from the King James Version, which is, "Thou shalt not kill." But the New International Version is just a little more accurate in its wording. You see, the Hebrew word here means kill someone unjustly. It's a certain kind of killing that's in view here. But what constitutes murder in this? You see, there are activist organizations claiming that this commandment includes the killing of animals. Some have taken this to mean that the commandment requires that Christians be pacifists and oppose all wars. So exactly what is this commandment addressing? One way to narrow the field is to look within the book of Deuteronomy itself. We find in Deuteronomy that God permits Israel in chapter 14 to kill and eat animals. And then if we take a look at Deuteronomy 17, we find that Israel is required to enforce the death penalty against certain crimes. And if we move to Deuteronomy chapter 20, we find specific guidelines given for Israel when they go to war. So at least in its original context, eating meat, the death penalty, and fighting in a war aren't automatically ruled out by the sixth commandment. So let's define it. What is murder? Murder is the unlawful or illegitimate ending of another person's life. The commandment only applies to humans. It only applies to an unlawful killing, that is, killing that's against society's laws, but it also is illegitimate killing as well, because there are times when killing a person is legal by that society. For instance, killing the Jewish people in concentration camps was legal in Nazi Germany, but it was illegitimate. So it was still a violation of the sixth commandment. Now let me give you some specifics, some examples of unlawful or illegitimate killing that happens in our culture. The most obvious example is homicide. I talked about that already. But most of us, we probably think, well, I've not killed anyone, so I'm okay. Maybe some of you are thinking, man, this was a waste of my time to come today. Hang around. Let's see if it's a waste of your time by the end of this message, okay? Well, another example is suicide. Every year, some 30,000 people in America take their own lives. Now, suicide is not the unforgivable sin, but it's clearly a violation of the sixth commandment. Another example is abortion. That's a hotbed, isn't it? Ending a human life while it's still in the womb. Even with the legalization of abortion on demand in 1973, it is a clear violation of the sixth commandment. The last example I want to give you this morning is violated in our culture today is euthanasia. And I'm not talking about letting nature take its course. I'm talking about lethal injection, physician-assisted suicide, things of that nature. In the Netherlands, physician-assisted suicide has been legal for several years. In fact, the government is expanding what physicians can do to help assist suicide. And it includes terminally ill patients, it includes children, it includes severely depressed patients, elderly that aren't happy with their quality of life. Friends, any unlawful or illegitimate ending of another person's life is a direct violation of the sixth commandment. Brings us to the second question. What's wrong with murder? Well, if we take a look at the book of Genesis chapter 1, here's what the Lord says. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And then if we look at chapter 9 in Genesis, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God, God has made man. So humans are created in God's image. Whatever it means, however we want to take that, we are in the image of God. Now, Bible teachers debate exactly what this is, but here it's a clear thing that God has set us apart because we are created in the image of God. We're created from the animal world, from plant life. We're created from all of that. The image of God applies to both men and women, puts it right there in the scriptures, in that verse, so we don't even have to wonder about that. The rest of the Bible claims that though that image of God has been twisted and has been marred because of sin, we are still in his image. We're still created in the image of God. Then we see in Genesis chapter 9 that the death penalty is required when someone murders because people bear God's image. Now, I don't want to get into a debate on the death penalty. I want to simply point out why murderers were put to death in the Old Testament. It wasn't because murder was a crime against society. It wasn't to deter people from committing such crimes. The reason was because we as humans were created in the image of God. And from this we find out why murder is so bad and so wrong. Since we bear God's image, wrongfully killing one another, human being killing one another, it's an attack against God himself. Murder is a defiant fist in the face of God. A defiant fist in the face of God. So imagine if our government sends an ambassador to a foreign country. Now imagine that whatever the ambassador said or did was an official representation of our government. Now imagine that the foreign government that had the ambassador arrested, beaten, and then executed. That would not only be horrible, a crime against the ambassador, but because the ambassador was an official representation of our country, the ambassador's murder would be considered a personal act of aggression against our country, because the ambassador officially represented who we are, and attacking that person was attacking our country. Well, since we bear God's image, we represent God. And to wrongfully take a human life is an act of aggression against the one whose image we bear. In fact, the ultimate fist in the face of God was when God sent his only Son into the world to provide a way of love and a way of forgiveness. But instead of receiving God's Son, instead of receiving God's love, people conspired together to have Jesus wrongfully arrested, wrongfully condemned, and wrongfully executed. But God in his grace was able to take something that man did that was evil and to turn it around to make it personally beneficial for us. Now this leads me to the next question. What leads people to murder another person? Some people claim it's our environment. It's the environment that leads people to acts of violence. And there certainly can be some link between violence in media and violence in our society. But it's not correct to say that this violence causes people to murder. Hey, let me tell you this story. Maybe you've heard it. Back in 1979, a man by the name of Dan White, he was a former San Francisco city employee, in fact, manager. He went into the workplace and he shot 2 men. His attorney tried to argue that his client's obsessive eating of junk food, sugary junk food, like Twinkies, caused depression in him. He was unable to distinguish between right and wrong, and it became known in America, and I looked it up. It became known in the American culture as the Twinkie defense. There are claims that years of child abuse will lead people to not be responsible for their crime. Although these things might influence people, it seems that the environment doesn't directly cause a person to commit murder. Others have claimed that it's our genetic makeup that causes people to murder. Yeah, man, we could go on a list of genetic makeups of things that cause us to do wrong, but we won't go there. Although it's certainly possible genetics can influence people to do certain things, there's no evidence that someone's genetic makeup directly causes them to murder. Jesus addresses the issue of what causes murder when he gave us the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, we're going to start looking at verse 21, and we're going to look at a few verses. He says, "You have heard that it was said to people long ago, 'Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, 'Raca,' is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of fire of hell." Jesus is addressing people who have read the Sixth Commandment. You know, hey, I've never killed anyone. I'm okay. Maybe you're saying the same thing. I've never killed anyone. I'm okay. Those of you watching by television, maybe you're saying, "Hey, I've never killed anyone. What's the big deal with this message?" Well, you're not watching by accident today. Hang on, we're going to get to some more. What Jesus is trying to tell his followers is we need to go beyond what we don't do and to get to the heart of the issue. He's telling us that unless our integrity surpasses the external righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, unless we get past looking like we're religious, is what he's saying. He says, then we're no better off or we're no different than they were. Jesus tells us that underneath murder is first anger. Now, the issue Jesus is talking about is the kind of anger that leads to angry words and angry actions. The word raca is the Aramaic word that means empty-headed, stupid, good for nothing. You know, kind of like what you called that person that cut you off on the highway. I'm not going to meddle. Then the word fool goes a little deeper. It's the Greek word for moron. Call someone a fool, might as well just call them a moron. Means they're stupid and they're good for nothing. Jesus is telling us that nursing anger in our hearts toward other people that usually leads to verbal abuse, whether we say it in our hearts or we say it with our mouths, is just as serious to God as murder is. Listen to what I'm telling you, friends. It's the heart of the matter. To follow Jesus, we need our hearts and our words as well as our actions. So what causes murder? Unresolved anger that leads us to devalue human life. Devaluing human life is the root cause of murder. Look at the many human ways that human life is devalued in our culture today. Abortion, domestic violence, child abuse, elderly abuse, racism, hate crimes, and the list could go on and on. If we look around the world, we see examples: genocide, mass killings by governments, unjust wars motivated by greed. We see that throughout the world, human life is devalued. Everywhere we look, humans are being viewed as objects. Rather than creatures made in God's image. The moment we define a person by anything other than God's image, we are on a slippery slope to devaluing that person. Think about the person you have devalued just this past week because of the way you've thought about them. That's the ground floor, friends. I'm not saying you're going to go out and murder someone, but the Lord is telling us it's just as bad. It's just as bad. This leads us to our final question. How can we be a follower of Jesus in a murderous culture? Jesus goes on to tell us in Matthew 5, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Then he goes on to say later in that chapter, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Live a lifestyle of radical reconciliation. A lifestyle of radical reconciliation. This is why you're here this morning. This is why you're watching by television. Because this is where Jesus wants us to be. That we are willing to reconcile. Maybe you're watching by television today and you haven't set foot in a church for years. And the reason you haven't set foot in the church for years is because someone in the church offended you, or maybe a pastor did something to offend you. I've been here for over 20 years. Maybe I offended you at one time and I ask forgiveness for that. But don't risk burning in hell because of something someone else has done. Get back into the house of God. Turn your life back over to Jesus. Reconcile with those who you feel have done you wrong. Jesus is telling us to do everything within our power to maintain positive, healthy relationships. Our worship, our gifts, our offering, our praise, they mean nothing if we're living alienated from other followers of Jesus. Christians, before we seek forgiveness from God, He wants us to get forgiveness from one another. Here's what He tells us. He says, a new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you. You must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Do you hear what He's saying? Love one another. He says, now in regard to our enemies, He says, love them and pray for them. When we fail to love our enemies, what are we demonstrating? We're demonstrating that we're no different than they are. No different than the social groups they belong to, who only love their own. This means loving the murderer, loving the abortion doctor, loving the militant homosexual, loving people who want to see the church destroyed. This is how the early Christians penetrated into the heart of the Roman Empire. Not with hatred, not with activism, but with love. How can we follow Jesus in a murderous culture? As followers of Jesus, God called us to live a lifestyle of radical reconciliation. Following Jesus means being different in how we treat people, both the people we love and the people we're tempted to hate. You know, you hear outside of the church walls people say in church they're just hypocrites. If we could learn to love one another, that accusation would go down dramatically. I understand we make mistakes. I understand that people will look at us differently at times. But let them accuse us of being compassionate and loving to one another, because that's what Jesus said that we need to do. The Christian community is designed to be the kind of place where people who might hate each other in society can learn to love and forgive each other. The sixth commandment, you shall not murder, forbids any unlawful or illegitimate ending of another person's life. And it does this because wrongful killing of any creatures created in God's image is a personal attack against God. But Jesus takes it a step further. For followers of Jesus, it's not enough just to refrain from murder. God calls us to live lifestyles of radical reconciliation. This lifestyle will lead you down some strange road, friends, strange roads. Roads that your unchurched friends aren't going to understand. Roads that your families might not understand or agree with. But friends, this is what it means to follow Jesus. Stand with me. Stand with me. I believe there are people in this very room that need to reconcile with each other. I believe there are people that you rub shoulders with on a daily basis that you need to reconcile with. Oh, it's humbling. Oh, it's humbling. But you know something? I'd rather be humble here on earth than be bold if I'm burning in hell. And I don't want to be graphic. It's not about what we don't do, it's what we're going to do and what we're doing. So, how do we take this from you shall not murder to make sure you have nothing against your brother or sister, or if you need to reconcile with someone outside of the body of Christ? I'll tell you how we got there. Jesus took it because Jesus fulfilled the law. And we don't have to use a knife or a gun or anything else. We can use our words and we can even use our minds. Paul says, ask the Lord to clean up our minds. So this morning, I'm opening this altar to you. Maybe you've got to do some reconciling within your own heart today. Maybe you need to go to someone in this auditorium and talk to them and just ask God to forgive the both of you. Whatever it might be. Friends, I searched my heart out because I don't want any aught between me and a brother. As far as I know, there isn't. And with our television audience, maybe there was there. I don't know. But I wanted to make sure that I asked forgiveness. So come to this altar. Come to this altar.